Good afternoon to everyone. On behalf of the Foreign Affairs Institute, welcome to today's event. My name is Marilena Gerandoni. I'm a journalist working for Mega Television and the newspaper Tovima. I have the honor to be the coordinator of this opinion-sharing conversation on the geopolitical evolutions in Eastern Mediterranean area and the broader Middle East, and the role of Greece as a pillar of stability in the wider region. We are looking forward to listen to all the issues that will be analyzed. I'm sure we'll receive a lot of interesting feedback. Before we get started, allow me to introduce our distinguished speakers who are all very knowledgeable on the current affairs and are going to enlighten us on today's subject. It's a great pleasure to have you here with us today. General Curtis Mike Caparotti, who in 2019 completed a distinguished 41-year career in the US Army as the commander, US European Command and Supreme Allied Commander, Europe NATO. General Caparotti graduated from the US Military Academy at West Point in 1978. Dr. Evripidis Stylianidis, a member of the Hellenic Parliament and head of the Greek delegation of NATO Parliamentary Assembly, served in several ministerial positions. Among others, he was a former Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs. The third speaker, General Ilias Leondaris. Among other positions, he has served at the NATO South headquarters in Naples and was a defense attaché at the Greek embassy in Washington, USA. The last stop of this 43-year military career was his service of the General Staff of the National Guard of Cyprus. And in a few minutes, we'll have with us Admiral Alexandros Diakopoulos. He will join this meeting. This will be like a roundtable discussion. The questions go to all of our speakers. When anyone feels to add something, to add a comment, he can intervene as soon as the previous speaker concludes. So I'll turn to our first speaker from the United States, General Curtis Caparotti. Sir, we are very delighted to have you today with us. A few weeks have passed since the announcement of the AUKUS alliance, and many people say that it's changing the balance around the world. Do you think that this is really affecting our region of the Southeastern Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean? And if so, in what way?
Well, thank you. And first of all, it's a pleasure to be here today. And I appreciate the invitation and to be with this distinguished panel. And particularly because, I've worked with the panelists here in the past, and it's good to see friends again. I only wish, as I said earlier, that I were in Athens and we were doing this together, as opposed to across the net. Well, as it comes to the AUKUS alliance, as it's been called, my view is that obviously, if we're talking about it, then it has influence in Europe, and it does signal, as you suggested, perhaps there is a shifting of a balance of power globally. The United States has said that its priority is in the Pacific as a result, but my caution would be this, and that is, as I've read most of this in the press and some of the comments of leaders in Europe, is we tend to take a very black and white look at this decision. In other words, that you're either in the Pacific or the U.S. is in Europe, but it's not, can't be in both. And I think that's a mistake. We've signaled a priority, but the United States is very close to our allies in Europe. It's committed to NATO, and it's going to continue to be a leader in Europe. And I don't think that this would be any change in that regard. At the same time, I think that it also is a signal, as we've seen some comments made, that in Europe, we need the European partners to strengthen their defense, that we're all in this together, and that we all need to do our share in terms of defense because of the complex world we live in. And then finally, as an American, I'd make this comment, and that is that part of the issue with the AUKUS alliance was the fact that we did this in a way that wasn't consultative with very close allies. And we've made that mistake several times here in recent years. And I think it's something that we in the United States have to take into consideration, that we can't operate that way, and that we will demonstrate humility and listen closely to our allies here in Europe. And I think that message has been delivered, and I think, that it was one that needed to be delivered. And I believe that we will, in fact, listen to that. So those are my comments on this, and I'd be interested in the others, and then I can pitch back in perhaps.
This was brilliant, General Caparotti. A perfect introduction, I would say, to what I'm sure is going to be a very important intervention by the rest of our speakers. Would like to hear what Mr. Stylianidis has to add.
First of all, I would like to thank you for this invitation. I'm very happy to participate in this panel. And it is a special happy moment for us because we have between us Mr. Caparotti, who has the experience to give us some informations and views. And all these views are valuable because they are coming from a very well-experienced general who played a very important role in the Euro-Atlantic relations. So thank you very much, Mr. Caparotti, for being with us. So I would like to make some comments to your first question. So I believe that the geopolitical global balance is rapidly changing. China is emerging as a new threatening pole, claiming the role of the first economic power. It directly competes with the United States in matters of artificial intelligence and tries to fill every gap left by the superpower. This development shifts the focus of international interests primarily from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean and the China Sea. The AUKUS alliance confirms this. The AUKUS alliance proves that Brexit was not an accident, but a different conscious strategy of Great Britain that seeks, along with its traditional allies, to overcome its internal problems, to bypass the slow-moving and bureaucratic European Union, and to re-enter the international geopolitical game aggressively. The United Union is at the beginning of a difficult transition period, I think. Its very characteristic is the leadership crisis, which is ahead. Germany will probably try to form a new government for a long time. France is already trying to regain its footing, and other countries are finding it difficult to trust and come to terms with a decision-making system that is going to abolish its foreign policy veto. There is a constant fear of a return to the ethnocentrism of the great states of Europe. For example, Greece experienced during the economic crisis Schäuble's attempt for a German-centered Europe, which is opposed to Helmut Kohl's Euro-Atlantic philosophy for a European Germany. Thank you.
General Leontaris, what do you believe?
First of all, let me thank, with my turn, let's say, you and the Foreign Affairs Institute of including me in this very distinguished panel. And I'm going to try to contribute to this discussion to, let's say, to the extent that my knowledge and experience allows it. So for me, I think that the start of this change that everybody is discussing now is dated more than a decade back. It was the time when China started to be considered as a threat for the United States, especially the financial or economic domain, not excluded the military, the cyber, or the space domains as well. It was the time when the Obama administration decided to end the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And the next phase of this decision, of course, as we know, took longer in order to be, accomplished. And the next phase of the same decision, let's say, took place during the Trump administration and ended up with the agreement which signed in Qatar in 2020 between the United States government and the Taliban, and concluded later on, later this August, let's say, with the withdrawal, the majority of the forces, international forces of Afghanistan, and the return of the Taliban regime to power. So, is it changing the balance of power around the world? My assessment is yes. It shows that the United States have redirected their strategic interest into Indo-Pacific, let's say, area, and the AUKUS agreement is part of this, let's say, development. So does it affect our region? Yes and no, I would say, a diplomatic answer anyway. Although we see that we see lower or smaller US presence in our area, for me, it does not mean that the United States have decided to abandon this region. We believe that the United States will remain in the area of Eastern Mediterranean or Eastern Mediterranean, the Middle East, and this area will be within the strategic interest of the United States. The reduction of the physical presence would or could be balanced by indirect presence, either by strengthening or enhancing, as we are going to see the new MDCA between Greece and the United States, enhancing the existing cooperations, or even more by establishing new, smaller or bigger bases in areas where there was no US presence before. So that means that we may see a different kind of, let's say, presence of the United States in the area. And of course, in any way, it doesn't mean that the United States abandoned the region of Mediterranean or the Middle East. I do believe that the strategic interest is here, and we have to see the Mediterranean in a different way. It's not just a place. It's a place where East meets West. It's, let's say, so many civilizations around the, let's say, the coast of the Mediterranean. We saw what happens the recent years with the Arabic Spring, with the crisis, Libya crisis, with the Syrian crisis, which is still ongoing, and of course, Iraq and Afghanistan operations. I can conclude with that for my first, let's say, introduction, and I will be at your disposal for further discussion.
That was an important thing to keep, the fact that the US will not abandon this strategic region, this strategic area. Maybe, as you said, it will be a different kind of presence here, the one of the United States. So my next question addresses to General Caparotti. As the former commander of US forces in Europe, you're perfectly aware of European defense capabilities. What changes do you think are needed in terms of strategy, personnel, and equipment in order to alter the European and Greek capabilities?
Well, thank you. I appreciate the question. It's a broad one because there's much that needs to be done. We are in a time, and we've been experiencing a time of dynamic change. And I think the change, particularly with respect to not only the political environment, but more importantly, the speed of change in technology and disruptive technology, et cetera, means that all of our forces, the US included, have to continue to modernize in order to have a force that's relevant to the times that we live in. So that's just a first general statement in that regard. What do we need to do? I personally always start with strategy. It is important, I think, that NATO and the military commanders over the last couple of years have developed a holistic strategy that embraces Europe as a whole. That is a movement that I think must continue, and it should continue into the new strategic concept in NATO. We lived, I would say, from the time of the fall of the Berlin Wall up until probably 2014, with the thought in mind that we could react to crises because we, the US, coupled with our NATO allies, were clearly stronger and we were technologically stronger, and there wouldn't be a large conflict. Well, that's not true anymore. And so we've got to break this habit of crisis response and begin to have a solid foundation of strategy. Now, having said that, I think that it's important that we look at the systems that are important. Generally, United mentioned a few of those, but we do have to look at, developing missile defense systems, air and ballistic missile defense systems, because precision missiles today are becoming of greater range and much more precision. And virtually anybody that has enough money to acquire them can. So all of our countries need to invest in those, and we need to, as allies, work together to establish a system that's connected and layered. We also need to work together to share technology in weapon systems and missiles to provide greater precision and reach, so that we have that capability outside the envelope of whatever our adversaries, might have or provide. Obviously, new areas like cyber, information domain are very important. And we've begun as allies, the Greeks and the US, and also our allies in NATO, to develop those capabilities and share those capabilities. Disruptive capabilities that have to do with, AI, quantum, those kind of things on the very far edge. We need to work as allies to be on that edge, to be ahead of our adversaries, and be able to predict before them how this might influence warfare. So those are general things that I would say. Space is another area that we just recently embraced in NATO. That's a big list, and it's expensive. But the point I'll close with, and I'll mention several times today, is that we are better off together as allies, US and Greece, as strong allies, and as allies within NATO. That within that framework, we can deal with this environment that we live in, and with the need for modernization if we work together. None of us, including the US, can do this alone. And that's a point that I'll come back to time and again here. Thanks.
Mr. Stylianidis, where do you stand on that?
Yes, the European Union, at the urging of the United States, and of course the secret desire of Germany and other member states of the European Union that did not want to pay like Greece, did not develop a European security and defense system. It mainly relied on NATO and of course of the force of Britain that withdrew, France as well as on armies like the Greek one, which protected their country against the Turkish threat. At this time, the future is uncertain, and in my opinion, it is wrong for the United States to abandon NATO and the Euro-Atlantic Alliance, because the European area is not just a security zone to the east, but also a stable value community. If I want to criticize somebody, I would start from our European colleagues. For a long time, they didn't hear the American leadership, and they didn't want to pay more money for the Euro-Atlantic cooperation in NATO. At the same time, they didn't decide to create an independent defense system in Europe. So both were wrong. Now we have to discuss again about the dimensions of our cooperation in NATO and also in the European Union. Thank you.
Mr. Leondaris, what do you think of what Mr. Stylianidis said?
Well,
what's your opinion on that?
I think that the topic has been covered, but I have to add this one, that there was a, let's say, a wrong perception for years, let's say, that the United States should do whatever it is necessary to be done in order to save or secure Europe. That is, let's say, a wrong perception and a wrong approach to this issue. In addition to that, if we go by numbers, we will see that there are only, out of the 30 NATO countries, there are only 3 which, let's say, meet the 2% requirement for the budget in defense expenses. And this is the States, Greece, and Turkey. So we have to, as the minister said, we have to discuss broadly with our European Union, let's say, allies or partners, to see how we can change our minds. I don't mean that it is necessary to create a purely European defense domain, but I think that we have to see how to better work on this one. Consider that 21 out of the 30 countries are members of both European Union and NATO, and there are only, I think, nine nations which are not European Union and 6 nations which are not NATO members. So we have to find a way. But NATO, as we will, let's say, probably discuss later, has all the, let's say, the panels and the forums in order to include everyone to cooperate with NATO, starting with PFP, with EAPEC, with Mediterranean Dialogue, with Istanbul Initiative, with the global partners. So there is room for everyone to cooperate with NATO. I don't see, how to say, the capacity of the European Union nations to pay twice the bill. One army for NATO and another army for European Union. We have to find a way how to merge these two, let's say, requirements in one capability. And I think that I have covered your questions.
We have with us Admiral Alexandros Diakopoulos. Let me introduce to him. He was a senior officer in the Navy, and also he was the first National Security Advisor of Greece in the government of Kyriakos Mitsotakis. It's a great pleasure to have you here with us, Admiral. I don't know, you want to add something on what the speakers told us about that?
Yes, let me first apologize for being a little bit late, but I had conflicting engagements. Actually, another teleconference, which was work, and it took somehow longer. So I'm really sorry. Good afternoon, everybody. And I heard some very interesting things, but it would be very helpful for me in order to reply to you if I knew the question.
Yes, we were talking.
NATO. It's about AUKUS.
It's about we've started with the AUKUS agreement and alliance, and we moved on to NATO. The speakers have pointed out many interesting things.
I get it. Okay, I will try to cover as soon as possible and being brief both things. Now, AUKUS was a big thing. And to my mind, the way I see things, we consider September 11 as the beginning of a stage, of a cycle. This cycle or this stage was closed with the evacuation of Afghanistan by the US and European forces. And now another circle begins, another stage, which is more volatile, which is maybe more multilateral and multipolar, and where the center of gravity has moved from Europe and the Mediterranean and Middle East to the Pacific. So this pivot to the Pacific, which was announced by President Obama, now we see it happening in front of our eyes. And that leaves some questions about Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean, which is our area. I understand very well why the countries in the Pacific had the need to close together, to close ranks, and to beef up their security. And to many analyses that I read, that I saw, everybody they were talking about the United States and the stage of strategy and the change of strategy, and how the United States, I don't know, they're leaving, abandoning Europe, which is not true. Maybe we should focus in the very aggressive Chinese policy in the area. I mean, it was the Chinese that literally threw the Australians to the arms of the United States. It was the Chinese reaction. I mean, when the Australians said something about we should examine how the COVID virus sprang out from Wuhan and whatever, the Chinese reaction was so forceful and brutal and offensive that really created, and it's not the only incident, I'm saying this as an example, that the Australians, they felt an extreme security and they need to beef up their security. Now, whatever happens there, and whatever happens in the South China Sea, because you were asking about the Eastern Mediterranean, and what happens here, there is, to my mind, first of all, with the globalization, the new technologies and everything, the world has become much smaller. So what happens in one part of the world has an effect in every other part of the world. I mean, in the past, maybe a century ago, we would say this is too far away. It's down under, it's another word. Now it's not. Everything is connected. We're much more interconnected. So what we see here is that there are some countries, especially the Western countries, who want a rules-based international system based on the international law and the law of the seas, and some countries which function in a different way, where might is right, and where when you have power, you impose your will even outside the boundaries of the law. So we have seen this happening in the South China Sea with the 9 dash lines, and we see this happening a lot, and Greece is a victim of this behavior with Turkey in the Eastern Mediterranean. I mean, there are not many. If you see, in essence, the way Turkey behaves and this blue homeland doctrine and the 9 dash lines, in the essence, I mean, you can find many differences, but in the essence, they have the same mentality. Now, as you have seen, there were some realignments. And we can see the Greek and French strategic agreement into the wider picture, where United States, of course, they will always be in the area. And United States, as you know, we're about to have a new MDCA, which will most probably be a 5-year MDCA. Okay, so our relations with the United States are strengthening. But on the other hand, you see that the Greek and French are coming together, and that will be something which will enhance stability and security for Europe and for Greece in the Eastern Mediterranean. It's not something which is against any other country, but it's something enhancing stability and security. So, okay, I see that this AUKUS and the Eastern Mediterranean things, there are some parallelism, which I try to explain. Now, regarding NATO, NATO will always be the pillar of European collective security, and there is no alternative. To my mind,
play a direct and crucial role, you think, in defending the West, or has it now become a slow-moving bureaucratic organization?
No, it's not a slow-moving. To the contrary, when it needs to, it can move fast. The thing is that Europe doesn't have an existential threat the way during the Cold War we had the Soviet Union. This is how you can explain a little bit that there are some, let's say, centrifugal forces that they don't feel they need, they don't feel, I mean, what makes you bundle together is the common danger. If you don't perceive a common danger, then you don't have the same need to unite forces. But again, we can say that Russian policy is threatening, especially for the countries of the Eastern Europe. And we have the danger from the south, which is not an old-time danger. It's not the traditional danger of a country, of a state, but it's the danger of Islamism and Islamic fundamentalism. So NATO is still relevant, and it's still the pillar of our security. I mean, for the time being. I don't see feasible. It's a pipe dream. It's worse than a pipe dream to believe that someday, at least in the foreseeable future, we're going to have a European army.
Do you think NATO should be complemented by smaller and more flexible formations such as AUKUS? Mr. Diakopoulos?
It can be complemented, but NATO, I mean, the Indo-Pacific is too far away from its area of operations. NATO is not for global threat. It's a North Atlantic treaty, and it's for the security of Europe. Now, AUKUS can be complemented by NATO countries or by even the alliance if there is a need. But this is not NATO's work. But the Greek and French agreement, or to put it more precisely, the new frigates that Greece is going to have to acquire from 25 and later on, they can be part of a NATO naval force. They will reinforce the NATO naval power by their sheer capabilities. So, of course, NATO is still the biggest and the most successful global alliance. It's not very relevant for what happens over there in the Indo-Pacific. I remind you that once we had a site or something like that, which was something like a replica for NATO for the Asian and the Indian countries. But this didn't work. So AUKUS is a response to this problem. And I think it will be more or less complemented by Japan. And maybe Japan, I'm sure, and maybe India and Korea than NATO. If you want to know.
Could I comment?
Yes, of course.
Please.
Of course.
I just want to reinforce what the Admiral had to say. I mean, first of all, it's interesting. We hear this question often about the slow and bureaucratic NATO. It's an organization. It has 30 countries that decide as one. That's complex. But if you look at the key issues, the urgent issues, they can make decisions relatively quickly.
Absolutely.
If you look at the number of decisions since, say, 2014, as this environment of ours began to change dynamically, it's a long list of pretty impressive and difficult decisions for nations to come together and make. I mean, a significant change from the posture we had in 2014 to today. So I think we sometimes, use that catchphrase, but those of us that work in it know that it does produce, and it has been a deterrence, and it has been a strong bulwark for defense of the transatlantic. And the second point he mentioned, and I like the way he said it, is these other associations are complementary to NATO's mission. I mean, there's always been small multilateral groups of nations like the Nordics, and in this case, France and Greece, et cetera, that have been a part of the strength of NATO. I as a SACEUR, I turn to those organizations often to get their view, to capture their view of their region, what they believe was important in going on in a specific instance. So these things are complementary in my view, and it's dangerous for us to look at it in another light. And I'll just leave it at that.
General Caparotti, in Greece, the dominant view is that our country is a pillar of stability in this part of the world, and the last border of Europe and the West in the region. How does the US defense establishment perceive Greece, and what's your personal opinion?
Thank you. I believe that the United States absolutely sees Greece as, a very strong and stable ally in what is an uncertain region, one that's been complex and changing, a very strong ally. There's no question, I think, in that view with respect to the government itself. In fact, I mean, just the fact that we're going to come together in a mutual defense treaty here soon, and I think for a 5-year period, I think speaks to the importance of that. And the strategic defense discussions that we've had over recent years speaks to that. My personal view is that you're absolutely a bulwark here in a complex area. And, I think back to, as I came in to the job as the SACEUR, what I recall in the early discussions with Greek leadership was that they always mentioned the Greek objective to bring stability to the Mediterranean, to work with others like Israel and Cyprus, and with countries in the Middle East in order to be a country that promotes stability, that can be an influence in stability in the region. And I think that's true today. So those are my opinions.
So my next question goes to everyone. In recent years, the US-Greece strategic dialogue has brought the relations between the two countries to their best point for decades. What do you think should be the next steps to further strengthening this relationship? Mr. Stylianidis, the floor is yours.
Yes, Greece till now lived several disappointments with the European Union, because it did not even dare to impose sanctions on Turkey when it used the tool either of immigration to blackmail them or the minorities to the detriment of the European Union and Greece. On the contrary, the United States immediately took measures such as the freezing of the F-35, and we hope them to maintain this decisive stance until the end. So the Greek government believes in the development of close strategic relations with the United States. It demands that it allows consistency to be recognized in practice. It advocates the upgrading US military presence in the Aegean and the Eastern Mediterranean. It calls for the development of co-producers in its military industry, as well for synergies in the field of energy market and security, like the TAP pipeline or the IGB, etc. And along with the United States, Greece promotes partnership with other countries in the region, such as Israel, Egypt, Cyprus, the United Arab Emirates, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, which are creating a single space in the Eastern Mediterranean. Greece remains a force for stability and reconciliation in the wider region. It's strengthening by the allies with protect our common interests and shield our common values and force Turkey itself to return to common reason. That's our view.
Mr. Leondaris, how can we further empower this close alliance, this close relationship?
Let me first add some, let's say, my personal comments concerning the NATO role, the NATO future role, if you like. This is, how to say, sensitive question whether or not NATO is a bureaucratic organization or system or whatever. So as you know, NATO is the only one political military organization, and it is by origin the only one collective defense. I think we have to use the right word. It's collective defense, not collective security. And that is what Article 5 says. And we have to pay much attention to that. There is no any other organization in the world referring to collective defense. And this is something that makes NATO, let's say, a specific organization. Now, it's also true that NATO, in the political party, let's say, of the organization, to me, seems like being a bureaucratic organization. But as General Caparotti said, it's mostly due to the decision-making system, let's say, or the decision-making process. When you have 30 nations to decide upon an issue, then it takes more time for discussion and negotiation in many cases. So this is a good thing from one point, because all nations, doesn't matter the size, doesn't matter the defense capabilities, are treated as equals, and the veto privilege goes for all. And each one of the, let's say, 30 nations can block a decision, but at the same time brings, let's say, this organization to this, let's say, hard position sometimes, in order to not to be able to decide very quickly, as probably should know. Now, the role, although the world has changed, and after the Berlin Wall fall and the dissolution of the Soviet Union, it is my understanding that a conventional war, like the ones that we studied in history, we're not going to see again with the same, let's say, characteristics. But NATO, I do believe that has a role to play. Of course, in order to accomplish this role and this mission, has to be adapted to the new threats, to the new needs, and to the new capabilities. And this is what, let's say, nations have to contribute to NATO. As it concerns the other part of the question, whether or not smaller groups are going to supplement the NATO, etc. This is common, let's say, common concept in NATO. Smaller groups are existed already. Like, as I said before, PFP, Mediterranean Dialogue, and as we saw, many NATO countries participated in the Gulf Wars, and there were, let's say, for the first time, we received the term willing group. There was a willing group of many nations participated in that war, and then there were many more nations to participate in Iraq and Afghanistan, and in that nations were included, let's say, nations from the global, and that's why we have the Global Partners Forum, etc. Now, NATO is changing, and we will see in 2022, in the NATO summit, we will see the new concept, and the new concept is going to include new, let's say, requirements and new capabilities in order to face with the new challenges, or the challenges which are developing right now. Like, as we said before, cyber, space, natural disasters, pandemic. We saw NATO be engaged in the how to say, in the COVID pandemic last year, and still goes. And we have to see, let's say, all these IT technologies, how influence nations, like the fake news, the social media, how they influence the public opinion. And not last but not least, we have to reconsider what real defense capabilities we should provide the NATO, let's say, forces, and also to pay more attention to both NATO command structure and to NATO force structures, because we are NATO, and NATO is for our collective defense. This one does not, let's say, simplifies the situation between Greece and Turkey, but that is a mistake in the NATO chapter. There is no provision in the NATO chapter what will happen when two NATO members have a conflict. This is another mistake that tries to be covered by Article 42 of the European Union or Lisbon Agreement anyway. Now, the role of Greece, it is important, and the relation with the United States goes back to 1835, 37, I think. We have diplomatic relations with 1868. And probably many Greeks do not know there were American fill-ins in 1821 revolution here in Greece. And there is an American fill-in society, which is, let's say, which is has kind of different, let's say, progresses in Chicago area anyway. So I think that what's going to happen after the new MDCA agreement, imagine that the first one was in 1943 during the Roosevelt period, and then it was followed by the Marshall Plan. And I think that myself and the Admiral were, let's say, mostly trained by the US concepts anyway, and we cannot change this one, Admiral. So I think that, as I said in my introduction, the presence of the United States may take a different, let's say, yeah, but it will be here. Anyway, I don't know if it is necessary to say what happens and in how many other places we see US forces here in Greece, but yeah, it's good to know that we are in a good path.
Admiral Diakopoulos, Greece has also improved its relations with a number of countries in its wider region, that is Israel, Egypt, United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, but it's facing aggression from at least one of its neighbors. What do you think are the tried and tested ways to address national security challenges, and how can relations in the region be further improved?
Okay. I hope you don't mind if I answer the question with for the United States as well. I mean, to see the whole thing globally, because as I said before, everything is interconnected. Now, Greece is a natural ally for the United States. And there are, some things which are permanent and basic, and some things that are circumstantial. What is permanent is, and if you look at it historically, in every major or minor war or conflict or Cold War and Hot War, Greece and the United States were always on the same side. I don't know any other in the area, country in the area, which can say that. I mean, others were in the Warsaw Pact. Other countries were with the Germans during the two world wars. Other countries, I mean, but Greece was always on the same side. And we have to understand why. We have the same values, we have the same system, we have the same look at history. But Greece is a naval country, and the United States is the prominent naval power. Greece has the biggest merchant fleet in the world, and the United States is the one who's keeping safe the sea lines of communication. So the underlying reasons are many and very sound. Now, as we know, in the 70s, late 70s and 80s, the anti-Americanism was a la mode. But there are many reasons. I'm not going to discuss this now. Since then, we have made a lot of progress. The political system has matured. And now the Americans doesn't sell politically as it used 50 years ago or 40 years ago. And the behavior of Turkey, which is moving away from the West, is drifting apart, and obliges the United States to try to hedge. They don't want to break up with Turkey, but they're hedging. So the country in the area, which is a reliable ally where they can invest, is Greece. And hence, we have this enhanced cooperation lately. I think you said very well that we're in the best relations for decades. And hence, we're going to have this military defense cooperation agreement, the MDCA, for a 5-year period, which is a strong indication that we're going to invest in this relation, and we're not going to renew it every year as we did in the past. So I see the future of the Greek-American relations are becoming better and better. I mean, after this 5-year MDCA agreement, I see more cooperation in every field. The fact that we have the United States forces and United States investments in the very sensitive part of Greece, in Alexandroupolis, is something incredibly important for us and amazing for our relation. And I would like to see someday, this is personal, it's not an official policy, but I would like to see someday these Bellara new frigates escorting and being embedded in the task force escorting a US carrier in the Eastern Mediterranean, and to have closer cooperation. And I think we're going this way. And the fact that Greece has good relations with all the Gulf countries and Israel and Egypt, all this reinforces this concept. Now, about the other relations that you referred, Greece, as you know, is a country which is basing its attitude and its policy on the international law. So, since we're the country that upholds the law, and we believe that the law gives us the right, and we're not going to change our traditional way of fending off the Turkish aggressiveness. We're fending off Turkish aggressiveness through our strong deterrent force, but through our alliances with the United States, through our participation in Euro-Atlantic institutions, NATO, EU, through our new strategic agreement with France, through our trilateral agreements with Cyprus and Israel, Cyprus and Egypt, Cyprus and Jordan, and now with the military agreements we had with the Emirates and Saudi Arabia. So we're creating a network to contain the Turkish aggressiveness in Eastern Mediterranean. And but I believe that these problems, I mean, that Turkey is creating, should be resolved only on the basis of international law and maybe in the international law of court.
General Caparotti would be very interested in hearing your point of view on that.
Well, first up, I would say that as the Admiral closed, I agree. I mean, it needs to be based in international law and perhaps international court to decide these disagreements. I would, my personal opinion is that as I've watched Turkey's authoritarian turn, and particularly their foreign policy in recent years, it gives me great concern. And I think we've seen both NATO and the allies within NATO struggle with this. And I personally believe, having been a SACEUR and having dealt with some of the actions that Turkey took in the Aegean, et cetera, that created a problem among allies, that it would be good to take this to an international court and resolve these issues. And the second part is that I think overall, Turkey needs to examine its relationship and its obligations to NATO, the values that the Washington Treaty professes, and that they, as a member, should support. And I'll leave it at that.
What about Turkey's efforts to develop its national defense industry, especially in relation to its international behavior?
Well, I mean, each country, is a sovereign country and has a responsibility to protect its people, its territory, and what it considers to be its vital interests. So the development of a military and a defense industry is natural, and it'll be a decision that each nation makes as to how they do that. I think of import here is how do they use that military and how do they use the assets. And here again, I go back to a member of an alliance within NATO that professes the values that we all share as a part of the Washington Treaty. And there's been some actions, obviously, in recent years that causes me concern in that regard.
Mr. Stylianidis, where do you stand on that?
Yes, I really believe that Turkey is moving in a red line, sometimes flirting with Russia, with brackets S-400, sometimes with ISIS and Muslim Brotherhood, and sometimes with Iran and the Taliban. Erdogan has gradually evolved from a leader of a reformist Islamic democracy in early 2004 to an Islam nationalistic and neo-Ottomanism protector. He constantly breaks relations with Turkey's traditional allies, Israel, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Emirates. He fights US supporters like the Kurds. He threatens Greece with war if it applies the international law. He violates the international law in Cyprus by despising the United Nations, like Famagusta resolutions. He constantly insults the United States president and humiliates European leaders in an unacceptable way, sending the wrong international messages. So I understand the necessity of the relationship between NATO and Turkey, or Greece and Turkey, or European Union and Turkey, but Turkey has to respect our community of values.
Mr. Leondaris, what do you think of that and the revisionist foreign policy of Turkey, which of course undermines Greek sovereignty and the Western Alliance as well?
Yeah, I think that the issue was mostly covered by our, let's say, panelists, but I would like to end to this one. As I see, the Turkish foreign policy goes from, let's say, the lower weaponizing the refugees to export them to Europe, to European Union, and to export also jihadists or proxies in Libya and Armenia, etc. These are actions which are irrational, thinking that Turkey has to act like being a member of NATO. And many people say that Turkey wants to be European Union member. I do not believe so, and I have my arguments on that. But some others say that Turkey has changed the way and left the West. And my question is, was Turkey ever part of the West. Okay, it has been a NATO ally. It has been other, let's say, as a kind of opposition forces to the Soviet Union in the past. But I don't know to what extent Turkey was a real member of the West. I mean, the principles of the West. Now, many people have named President Erdogan as a kind of autocrat. And I think that the autocrat is merely the symptom of a broader problem. And this problem consists of the Ankara's promotion of the pan-Islamist, neo-Ottomanism ideology that has dangerous implications, not only, let's say, for the Eastern Mediterranean, the Middle East, I can say for the broader area, as Turkey tries to be somehow the leader of the Muslim, let's say, community in the world. Now, if you allow me to go back, what Davutoglu used to say, Davutoglu, the former foreign minister of Turkey, as you remember, had, let's say, the concept or the idea that Turkey is going to become a nation with no problems, or not problems with the neighbors, or zero problems with the neighbors. And from that point, we have seen that Turkey has only problems with the neighbors. And this is another issue that we have to consider. And to conclude on that, whatever we see today, to include the, the casus belli for Greece, which is a decision late in the 90s, I think that the policy that Turkey follows today is part of this national pact, as they call it, Turkey's, the Misaki Milli in 1920s, which, let's say, according to this national pact, Turkey claims territories from Eastern Thrace, the Greek, let's say, former Greek, let's say now part of Greece, the part of Greece, to Cyprus.
In my constituency.
Yeah. To Cyprus, the Eastern Aegean Islands, part of northern Syria, northern Iraq, the entire Armenia, part of Georgia, of course, some, let's say, areas in Iran. So we have to see how to deal with this, let's say, Turkish foreign policy. And let's say, just to save some of your time, to go to the defense industry. Yes, it's true that Turkey, let's say, recent years has invested a lot in the technology, and this investment had an impact in the development of the defense industry. We saw, let's say, many products. However, it is true that Turkey is, let's say, dependent on imports of basic materials in order to prepare either the fighter or the battle tanks, or even the drones, which is now, let's say, common in the area with the Bayraktar and the Anak, etc. I think that a defense industry cannot be sustainable only with domestic clients, with domestic customers. And this is the problem for the Turkish, let's say, defense industry. 90% of the products goes to the Turkish armed forces, but as soon as you have one battle tank in the armed forces, it takes 40 years in order to change it. So you have to see what this industry is going to do this 40 years, let's say, period. And the other thing is that from Europe, although there are no sanctions as we would like to see against Turkey, there are some individual nations who have changed the way of dealing with Turkey, and they do not export basic materials for manufacturing, let's say, like engines for the aircraft, or chips for the drones, or engines for the drones, or many other things, let's say, that are necessary. We see some better, let's say, some better situation with the shipyards and the program that the Spanish government goes along with Turkey for this type of carrier, supposed to be the carrier for the F-35s. 35s are not going to be in Turkey anymore. We will see how this one is going to be used. But many people have also the same question, and I'll go along with them. Is the Turkish defense industry development a success story or just a bubble? So that is where I stand, let's say.
Let's listen to Admiral Diakopoulos on that.
So I take the mantle from the General Leodaris. Up to now, and so far, it's a success story. Now it remains to be seen how this thing is going to evolve. Turkey, as every other country, they're entitled to have their defense industry. It's very legitimate, even laudable. I mean, and they made a lot of progress, strides, and they even produce advanced weapons, new technologies. And I'm not talking only about their drones, which made a lot of impact in Libya and Nagorno-Karabakh war, but and of course in Syria. But even they managed to build and equip frigates and corvettes. I mean, advanced ships. Now, there are many factors that weigh into that. One is that they have a big army, it's the second army in NATO, so they could have economies of scales when they build something, even if not even if they don't export it, they can build it in large amounts, so they can have economies of scales. Another is that during their procurement program in the past, they demanded, and in many ways they managed to have it, to have a technology transfer. So they use this technology transfer to build their own weapon systems. And another thing that they used a lot, it was the reverse engineering. I mean, the systems they had, they did some reverse engineering to build their own. I'm not sure this is going to last. I'm skeptical, as General Lodaris is, whether this has strong fundamentals and they can really compete with traditional producers of weapons. But for the time being, I mean, a lot of successes, and I can say that I envy them about that. Now, you ask about the way they use it. It's a different story. I mean, to produce weapons is one thing, and I can't see any wrong with that. But to use it outside the framework of international law, as they did, then it's a problem. But this is the problem of Turkish policy in general.
My next question addresses to everybody. Should Greece participate in the F-35 program after Turkey's ouster from it? And how can Greece develop its own domestic defense industry, especially within the European context, which brings with it both advantages and disadvantages? General Caparotti, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. On the question of the F-35, yes. Absolutely, Greece should look forward to the F-35 in the future. We have a long history of working closely in defense industry and in common interoperable systems. And that relationship also has helped the defense industry in Greece. So I think without a doubt, the last thing about the F-35 is just, it's a remarkable aircraft. And when you bring the F-35 in, you don't bring in a plane. You bring in a system that is a force multiplier for all the other systems that it connects with. It's remarkable in that way as I've watched it work. The defense industry itself, what I've seen in my experience is that most countries seeking to develop a defense industry, purchase defense systems, and within those agreements, then they work out mutually beneficial arrangements for maintenance and repair and operation facilities, et cetera, for parts, for making parts of those systems, and for technology exchange. And that's been a part of, I think, what has occurred between the United States and Greece over time. And I think that that should continue. That's the best way for Greece to develop and continue to develop, its important defense industry. There's good example of that in MROs that exist within Greece today, those maintenance, and facilities, et cetera. I just Googled it real quick here preparing, and there's any number of them that come up. Those are the kinds of things that begin to build expertise, skills, and then with agreements, technology exchange. And I think Greece is on a good track in that regard. And I think the strength that the U.S. Has with Greece and the relationship with our industry is a strong one and is an important one.
General Leondaris.
Yes. So to this question, whether or not Greece should be part of the F-35s, let me start answering this way. So we see that is in place now, the F-16s Block 52, the normal and the advanced ones to F-16 Vipers, sorry. So that means that we're going to have close to 100 aircraft of this to the state-of-the-art F-16 version anyway. The second, what is followed to that is that the parts, the kits will be, let's say, out of the Block 52 fighters are going to be used in order to upgrade the Block 50s to Block 52s. So we're going to have some, let's say, close to 50 more aircrafts in this Block 52 version. This one, in conjunction with the 24 Rafales, which are going to be operational in the Greek Air Force until 2023, I think that it makes things a little bit difficult for Greece to consider a new aircraft, since, you know, these two types, three types, F-16 Viper, the F-16 Block 52, and the Rafales are going to have, let's say, a life cycle for the next 20, 25 years. And I think that it's not enough time in order to consider a new type of aircraft. In addition to that, although I'm not an Air Force, let's say, expert, I have read and I have heard many, let's say, visions on whether or not the F-35, which is a state-of-the-art aircraft for the moment, it is applicable or fits to the Greek, let's say, area of operational requirements. So this is something that has to be considered by both. But I have no any doubt that F-35 is a state-of-the-art plane, and I have seen that, let's say, standing and operating in the States. So now, as it concerns, your second question was whether or not Greece should develop a defense industry. As I started saying with, let's say, for Turkey, I think the same goes with Greece, but keeping, let's say, the analogy of the numbers anyway. In order to have a sufficient defense industry, you have to have some let's say, requisites, preposition anyway. We have to have sufficiency of raw materials, at least positive dependence on other sources where it will be easy to get them. You have to have advanced research opportunities for model developments, and of course the necessary finance or budget for this issue. You have to have to be independent, or to rely, the less could be, on imported know-how, because nobody sells you for free know-how. Then you have to have an interconnection with the universities and the production process. And I remember Minister Stylianides, when he was the Minister of Education, I remember a lecture of him in Washington talking about this, how to link the universities with the production line and how to keep the brains in Greece in order to work on that. We still waiting to see that, Minister, how this connection between the universities and the production line will go. In addition to that, we have to, let's say, to develop our human resources in technology. We have a brain drain, as you know. We have to stop it and to keep the brains within, let's say, the Greek territory in order to develop the defense industry. And then, let's say, in conjunction with Turkey, we have how to develop this network, the export network. We are a small, let's say, we have small defense forces, and I think that our defense forces are not enough in order to sustain a defense industry. We have to find, let's say, customers abroad. The other thing is that we have, as soon as you have a defense, means, either weapon or battle tank or whatever, you have to be able to support it for its life cycle, and it goes for 40 to 30 years. The customer has to have spare parts, has to have after-sale support, as we lay, for the vehicles, etc. And above all, we should bear in mind that the defense industry of Greece used to work. We had good defense industry, But for some reason, decisions which were made in the last decades show that most probably our political system did not like to have a national defense industry. That's why we see what we see today, what it happens within the national defense industries. So, but we have very good private defense industries, which have, let's say, deals with the states and many other countries in the world. And probably we should pay more attention to this initiative, to the private defense industry, and to improve it better.
Mr. Stylianidis, where do you stand on that?
If you ask me about F-35, I would answer with a clear and strong yes. I was the first member of the Committee for the Defense in the Greek Parliament who proposed this idea before the American-Turkish crisis. And I support even now the idea because I really believe that we have to plan the future. So everything we plan has to do with our future, not only the defense of Greece, but also the defense of Europe. We are the second buffer zone of NATO behind Turkey, and we have to understand that. Turkey shows that is not a reliable partner, a neighbor for us. So we have to continuously to try to make our relation, my bilateral relation better, but at the same time, we have to take care of it. To take care and to take the necessary measures, the realistic measures. So generally speaking, only the economic development, the military aid, the geopolitical upgrade of Greece can shield the interest of the alliance in the Balkans, the Black Sea, and the Eastern Mediterranean, and enforce the respect of international law by Turkey, returning it to the path of logic, prudence, and conciliations. The opportunistic retreat to the demand of an Oriental neo-Ottoman bazaar will send the wrong international message, undermining the role of the Euro-Atlantic alliances and endangering even international balances. I want also to describe you an experience I had as head of the parliamentary delegation of Greece in NATO. I had the opportunity to visit Israel some years ago, and I had discussions with the leaders of Israel. They offered me a book with the title, How to Rebirth a Nation. In this book, they describe how they managed in the past to reform the comparative disadvantages they had as a state and as a nation to international comparative advantages. So they didn't have energy, they didn't have water, they didn't have weapons, they didn't have medicaments, so they didn't have, and they created Leviathan, they created a special policy for water with desalination, they created a very modern defense system, they created generics and the new technology. They attracted the foreign investments in Israel without taxes. They offer them immobilian to invest. They created partnerships and common products with the local private sector, like the general described before. They enforced the universities to be involved in the research and common projects. And finally, they managed to pass this dominant role in the area, and now using the alternative diplomacy to create this network of friendship with the other countries. We could not imagine in the past this result if we spoke about Israel. I think nowadays, this role in the Balkans, in the Black Sea, and in the area of East Mediterranean belongs also to Greece. I have the feeling that the leadership of the United States understands that, and I have the duty as member of the Greek Parliament to persuade my colleagues and to support my government in order to implement a policy like this, a strategy like this.
Admiral Diakopoulos would like to hear your opinion as well about Greece's participation in the F-35 program.
I will reply to both. First of all, from a strategic point of view, I would love to have F-35. Along with F-22, maybe they're the best airplanes now in the air. And of course, it would be a huge asset for us, and it would give us even more air superiority vis-a-vis the Turkish threat. But it's very expensive. Not so much expensive as an item to buy a plane. It's expensive, the infrastructure that you need to operate these planes. And they are still very expensive in their operational costs by the hour. And I believe that after the purchases of the frigates and the huge contracts for the Rafale and the modernization of the F-16 to the Viper mode, it would be very difficult. We don't have the budget to buy the F-35, though we would love to. I believe that for the next 10 or 20 years, there will be no big purchase of airplanes. And after 10 or 20 years, maybe the new airplanes will be unmanned, and we will not be talking about manned planes at the time. So I would like to have F-35, but I don't see this happening, at least for the current decade. Now there's no other budgetary room for that. Regarding the defense industry, Greek defense industry, the way we built it, it was all wrong. I mean, if somebody wants to have a book about how to do it, everything wrong, it doesn't need to do anything else than to examine the way we built and operated the defense industry, especially the state defense industry, which became, with all due respect to Mr. Stylianidis, whom I know and I respect a lot, and he's a man who has given a lot to, and he's still giving a lot to the country, and he's one of the best politicians we have. With all due respect, the politicians used the defense industry as a parking lot to park their clients and political friends with lucrative salaries. The defense industry in Greece was sucking the blood of the armed forces, who were paying extremely expensive their services, just for those working in the defense industry to have their salaries and the other perks. Anyways, since we talked about Israel, okay, we had the rebirth of a nation, and then Israel became the startup nation. And this is the way you can build your defense industry if you're a small country like Greece. But Israel didn't build its defense industry in a vacuum. They have created this economic and technological ecosystem where these startup and new technology companies would thrive, and they were interfeeding the private and the public sector and the defense sector and the commercial sector. And they were interfeeding in the new technologies, and the one brought the other. I mean, you cannot have, in order to have a real and serious defense industry, otherwise you go for small niche industries, private industries. In order to have a serious defense industry, you need to have a strong economy and a very strong technological basis where the public sector, the private sector, the academy, the universities, everybody cooperates and everybody is reinforcing the other. And then you can build a defense industry. Have in mind that, as General Lodard said, and as I said before, we have small armed forces, so we cannot have a defense industry just for Greece. It should be a defense industry able to export. And the last thing, we should take advantage and profit for the opportunities that PESCO in the European Union gives us to have some mutually beneficial collaborations with France or other European countries. I mean, now the new contracts and with France and the PESCO programs in European Union gives us an opportunity if we want to build a really healthy and capable defense industry, which we should build. For us, I mean, since we're not Belgium, we're not Luxembourg, we're living in the most dangerous neighborhood, and we need to have a defense industry just to enhance our defense capabilities.
And the last question is addressed to all the speakers. Allow me to remind you that we have only 8 minutes to go. In defense procurement program, it's evident that economic, political, strategic, and tactical factors are taken into account. What, in your opinion, should be the hierarchy of factors in order to arm a country in the best possible way? General Caparotti.
Well, thank you. I'll be interested in what my colleagues say here. In terms of a hierarchy, the way I approached this was, starting out philosophically, and that is that, warfare and hence the military forces that you build are an extension of your policy. And so when you talk about hierarchy, you've got to get the basics right. And that's understanding, the policy and the values of your nation. A part of that policy is the idea of universal service, I think, in a democratic country is fundamental of that. And is that infused in your people? That's a very fundamental part of building, I think an armed force. There's strategic factors, as the Admiral said, where you live. Do you live in a dangerous part of the country, a dangerous part of the world, or not? Geography shapes this. And then finally, obviously, it comes down to resources at that point and what a nation's willing to spend on its defense. And in speaking to that, I just cover several things. First is that deterrence is cheaper than conflict. Pay up front will be cheaper than the conflict that you may get in if you don't. That a long-term and consistent defense strategy is more efficient and effective. And that predictable funding over a long term is more productive and less expensive in the long run. I've was often asked why Russia can produce modernization or China can modernize in the numbers that it has in a short period. A lot of this comes back to the factors I just talked about. They're an authoritarian government, and they don't have the issues that democratic countries must deal with in order to efficiently build a force. So I'll leave it at that, and I'm interested in their view on this.
Thank you very much. General Leondaris.
Yeah, thank you. So let me start with this one. The armed forces of each one of the states around the world is an executive branch, and they have, let's say, they have to execute a mission given or assigned by the government. In order, as most of the countries, the concept is more or less the same. First to deter and then to defend the country. So given that mission, the armed forces have to produce, let's say, or to come to some proposals what the operational requirements are. So the government knows exactly, depending on the mission that has been assigned to armed forces, what the requirements are. So then we start to prioritize this one. And how to prioritize? I think that taking into consideration, again, the area that we live, and we may choose many things in our lives, but we cannot choose our neighbor. And in our case, we live next to a troublemaker anyway. So I think that we should start from what it is called, let's say, national security, where it is included the defense, and of course, the protection of the independence and the sovereign rights. Then you go to support your national interests, let's say, and to support your diplomacy within the cycles that your foreign policy, it is implemented anyway. And of course, as I said before, the sovereign rights, and taking into consideration all this in conjunction with the operational requirements of the armed forces, then you go to the most important factor, which is the fiscal situation of the country. To what extent the financial situation of the country can support the requirements of the armed forces, or how quickly you can go to cover all these needs following, let's say, a system of priorities. But you have to know that when we decide to buy something, as let's say it happens with the frigates or the Rafales, we decide some months, a year ago, and we're going to have the Rafales operational in 2-3 years. In 5 years, it is the frigates, and it is not that going to supermarket and buying a system that works the other day. You have to plan it, and you have to have a site. when a weapon system has a life cycle of 25 years, according to the procurement system, the Greek procurement system, you have to start 10 years in advance in order to have the weapon system in place the time that you need to have. And we know that we blame NATO as a bureaucratic organization, but we have to see how bureaucratic our organizations are. So national security, national interests, sovereign rights, and fiscal capabilities in order to cover the operational requirements for the armed forces. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid we are running out of time. So we would appreciate hearing a brief sum up from all of you regarding this debate, starting with Mr. Stylianidis.
So I really, when I speak about the bilateral relations between United States and Greece, I would like to speak about the meeting between the strongest democracy and the older and most experienced democracy. And I see that also in the American Constitution, which is the most similar constitution with the Greek one. So I would like to say, concluding my thesis, two comments. The first is that the people have feelings. The states have interests. Our countries have common interests, and our people have common and positive feelings. We fight together for freedom, democracy, and friendship, and I'm sure that we will find the way to win the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Diakopoulos, Admiral Diakopoulos.
I don't have to say much. What I have to say is that, as I made a reference before I mentioned, it was always, but this was always the case, but now is more than before, more than in the past. We live in a very dangerous world. We live in a world where the more volatile world and maybe more unpredictable. There is no stability the way it used to be during the Cold War period. For all that, for Greece to be able to survive, to be able to defend, to be able to safeguard its security, we need strong alliances. We need a strong partnership with the United States, and we need to build in a very healthy basis our defense industry and our economy.
Thank you, Admiral.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. General Caparotti.
Thank you. I would just reiterate what you've heard from the others. The first is that I believe that Greece is a like-minded ally and with strong democratic credentials, and we have a very strong relationship, and it's getting stronger. Secondly, given the complex security environment that we're in, we've got to work together, and we need to be a part of an alliance. And acting as an alliance and taking into account each of our interests as one, we can deal with the environment that we have today and the one we find ourselves in. That's the only way I believe we can be successful. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Last but not least, General Leondaris.
Yeah, I think that I would say for closing that I would prefer to see more cooperation and synergy rather than competition, either in the bilateral, let's say, relations or within our organizations where we belong, either European Union, NATO, or whatever else it is. Unite, we are stronger. We have to understand that we can cope with our adversaries only if we stand in the same principles and follow the same, let's say, goal, and something that we do not see regularly. We have to have a clear end state where we would like to go. If we decide, and I agree on that, where we would like to go, everything comes easier next. So thank you very much for having us.
Thank you very much. We have reached the point where I have to bring this discussion to an end. It goes beyond saying that all the standpoints we've heard were really interesting, and our role is to keep a watchful eye and mind as well on whatever arises in the broader region without excluding anyone from the discussion. Dear gentlemen, I want to thank you all for your participation and for sharing your fantastic insights. For any of those who joined our discussion and want to revisit it, it will soon be available on the site of the Hellenic edition of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Affairs Institute. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.